In order to start talking about the Rishonim, we should talk about what that term really means. So Rishonim literally means the first ones. The Rishonim are the first ones. The first ones of what? So you have to go backwards a little bit and learn a little bit of Jewish theology here. There is this concept in Jewish theology that actually is quite important for understanding how Talmudic jurisprudence in general works, and it's called in Hebrew Yerida HaDorot, or the decline of the generations. This concept essentially argues that earlier generations, from starting with Moses' generation, shown here, portrayed brilliantly by Charlton Heston, the generation called the Dor Dea, the generation of knowledge, that actually heard the first two of the commandments spoken by God, that was like a pinnacle of a kind of spiritual wisdom that would be fading generation after generation. Meaning, because they had all had, I'm not going to go into the whole religious material here, but it's important for us to understand the generation of the Exodus had achieved such a closeness to God from that moment at Sinai that every subsequent generation invariably represents a decline. And this decline is not necessarily intellectual in nature. So, for example, when Talmudists are trying to determine a specific law, the rule is not to go to the earlier authorities, but go to later authorities, because they tend to have more facts at their disposal. Like, for example, if you wanted to know, is a microwave kosher for cooking, you would not ask some rabbi who wrote about things in the 19th century, because he wouldn't have those kinds of facts at his disposal. You would have ask someone writing in the late 20th century to be able to discuss it. And there's a lot more reasons for this, but essentially the intellectual capability of later generations is not questioned. It is the spiritual capability, the sensitivity, the ability to penetrate to the core of an issue that is considered to decline from the moment of Sinai downward, through the prophets and through the sages and so on. So the major people, the major groups that we're speaking about in the medieval period begin with the Tanaim, and these are literally the teachers. They are associated with the Mishnah, and their activity is more or less from the year 200 before the Common Era to 200 of the Common Era. The following generation are called the Amoraim. Amora means literally the sayer. And what this refers to, or the speaker if you want, what this refers to is that this is already a term used in Babylonia in particular, where the vernacular was Aramaic and the texts of the Tanaim were in Hebrew. So you would have a teacher, a rabbi, who would give the lecture, and then a professional human microphone or loudspeaker would then repeat it in Aramaic translation so the population could understand it. And the sages of this generation, in humility, they referred to themselves simply as the repeaters, the speakers, the Amoraim. So these are the sages associated with the Talmud from about the year 200 of the Common Era to about the year 500 of the Common Era. An Amora may not override a Tana. An Amora does not have the same authority as a Tana because of the idea of the decline of the generations. However, if there are two Tanaim who disagree, and an Amora can bring support for his argument with another Amora by quoting one of those Tanaim, then the Amora has support for his argument. So they borrow from earlier times to prove later arguments. I know that's complicated, but we'd have to talk a lot more about Talmud to understand that. The next generation, there's some dispute over what exactly the Savoraim were and when they were, but they blend into the period of the Geonim, which we did speak about a little while ago. And these are the post-Talmudic authorities, primarily based in Mesopotamia, up until about the year 1000. And now we get to our protagonists, the Rishonim. They are called now the first ones. They're clearly not first when you consider them within the scope of the prior authorities, but they represent a distinct chunk of intellectuals who are writing particular kinds of things roughly during the period 1000 to 1500. I've rounded these numbers off, obviously, but this is the era of the Rishonim. And what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what they did, why they deserve their own name, what makes them so special, and they are distinguished from the later authorities called the Acharonim, literally the after ones or the later ones. The Acharonim definitely also have a very distinct style, very different from the Rishonim, and I'd like to spend more time about that, but God willing, when we get to the fall, we'll talk about the Acharonim. Note that they kind of stop at around the year 1900. I think it's because in the 20th century, although there's no real kind of dramatic break between the people who were writing in the 18th century, 19th century, but by the time you get to the 20th century, there's just people feel like, wow, I can't be an Acharon. You can't call me an Acharon like the Maharsha or like the Ketsos or something like that. It's too much. So we'll come back to that. But at any rate, these are the sort of terms used for these big intellectual chunks of time and the sort of things that are happening in there. So let's understand what were the Rishonim up to. So they're involved in three main activities. They were largely commentators, counters, and codifiers. These three groups and these three types of activities were especially important for the Rishonim, and we'll understand them in turn here. So here's a beautiful picture, by the way. You're going to see it again in the next class, of an illuminated manuscript of the Guide for the Perplexed. You see there is Maimonides on the right, and he's wearing tefillin, and he's holding up an astrolabe, which is one of the key inventions of the era of the Rishonim, and Rishonim are often pictured holding on to them, their astronomical devices for navigation and things like that. And he's speaking to his students over there. And notice the artwork around the outside, which is absolutely fantastic. At any rate, commentators. So one of the most important figures, one of the people who is regarded as the rabbi of all Israel, and in fact, the acronym of his name is Rashi. His name is actually Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, or Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, Solomon, the son of Isaac. But it's also sometimes playfully translated as Rabban Shel Yisrael, the rabbi of all Israel. A brilliant figure who we will have occasion to speak about next week when we come to the Crusades, who essentially embarked on a massive sweep of Jewish literature, a tour de force, providing very pithy, short, but incisive and deeply clarifying comments on the entire Torah, the entire Tanakh, the entire Talmud. Massive, massive amount of work that he actually repeated several times. He went through several editions. There are, unfortunately, a few lost tractates where either he did not complete it or we've lost it. But otherwise, we have this guide that takes you through all of the major texts of Judaism in the 11th century. And his style is absolutely enlightening. Children study it because it is so clear and gets to the point of the matter. Now, also, his clarity is, you see the art in it because he takes very complicated things and he edits them down to just 3 or 4 words quite often and just gets across the idea. One of the most important things that Rashi did is his commentary on the Torah itself, the first 5 books of Moses. And in fact, people say that the correct way to learn Torah is with 2 fingers, one finger following the Hebrew text, the other finger following Rashi's commentary. And in fact, in discussions with the Christian colleagues who are Bible scholars, I realize how deeply ingrained it is in Jewish study of the text to always be following along with a commentator, and there are several to choose from, obviously, but Rashi is clearly the king of these commentators. One of the major elements of his intellectual art was his awareness that a major desideratum was to bring the oral Torah, that is the Midrash, the Mishnah, some of the esoterica of what would later be called the Kabbalah, and bring that into the text itself through the commentary. So when you're learning the text of the Torah with Rashi's commentary, you see sometimes, really strange, difficult passages. Rashi will say, don't worry, the oral Torah addresses the questions that you're probably having, and he'll bring in these brilliant insights from the oral Torah. And so it really makes the study of the Torah with Rashi a complete, comprehensive study of the Torah as a whole. One of the interesting engines of Rashi research today is the perennial question, what's bothering Rashi? Like, why did Rashi choose to tell us this? And you figure out the question that Rashi must have had that drove him to give us the answer. And it's tremendously satisfying learning. So Rashi is one of many. He is definitely the king of the era, but he is one of the most important commentators who provide insight into these ancient texts and make them accessible for his generation and for the following millennium. He is as fresh today as he was in the 11th century. The second major group, which are less significant today in terms of people following in their footsteps. There are many people who are like writing commentaries upon commentators. Of course, there are super commentaries on Rashi to this day, but are the counters. In Hebrew, they're called the Monei HaMitzvot, the counters of the commandments. So based on a passage in the Talmud, a very well-known passage in which there's a description of 613 commandments in the Torah. The Rishonim began to say, okay, well, let's make a list. Let's go through the Torah and let us actually provide a list of all 613. Of course, what happens is when you get multiple rabbis working on one problem, frequently you get multiple solutions, right? Like 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And in fact, they all have to come up with the number 613 because that's the number that the Talmud says is there. But then they disagree as to, no, you're counting something that's not a mitzvah. I don't count that mitzvah at all. And the other one says, no, you're counting 2 things as 2 separate mitzvot. They're really only 1 mitzvah. Or you forgot about these mitzvot. What about these, right? So the counters essentially try to place some kind of systematic order on the commandments that appear in the Torah, and it's hugely consequential because it will especially lead to the next category. But just to give you an example of one of the Rishonim that is my favorite counter for sure, this is an anonymous counter, often identified with one Aharon of Barcelona, Spain. Quite possible, although there's significant questions that perhaps it was something else altogether. So it's an anonymous book called the Book of Chinuch, or the Book of Education. And it is the greatest bar mitzvah present ever, where this particular rabbi wants to give a bar mitzvah present to his son. So he essentially says, here, I'm going to list out all 613 commandments. I'm going to list them in the sequence in which they appear in the Torah. So when you go to synagogue every week and hear the Torah read, you'll be able to review all of the mitzvot that occur in that week's parsha. And that's brilliant. That's great. Really helpful just in itself, isn't it? But what he does after that is so much more amazing. First of all, he locates the mitzvah in a count, and they're literally counted 1 through 613. The English translation that's used wisely today is the 3-volume set. And then he tells you a little bit about how the mitzvah is performed. And then he tells you a little bit about, and this is amazing and not so common as you would think, he tells us why we have this mitzvah, this commandment. And that's like so valuable because many of the other authorities from the Talmud on really don't think about that, or if they do think about it, they don't write a lot about it. There's this a sort of religious approach to the text saying, here is the commandment, and it is incumbent upon us to observe it, kasher tzivanu Hashem Elokai, as the Lord our God commanded us, right? He didn't tell us to think about it. He told us to do it. I'm generalizing. There are a lot of people who would say, no, we have an obligation to think about it too. At any rate, the Chinuch provides the why answer to a lot of these commandments, to all of them actually. We don't necessarily, not all of the Rishonim agree with his response, but it is absolutely brilliant, and like I said, the world's best bar mitzvah present ever. We know that it was a bar mitzvah present, and we know a little bit about him and his son because, he speaks to his son directly in the text. It's really very sweet and engaging. We know, for example, that they were Levites because he says, my son, pay attention to this mitzvah because you're a Levi and you're going to have to keep this particular mitzvah. It's brilliant and highly enjoyable. And then finally, most significantly, because it flows directly from the counters, are the codifiers. And this is hugely important because essentially these are the people. One of the most important that I've listed here is Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, known as the Rosh, or the head, who go through these commandments and they say, okay, thank you, for example, anonymous author of the Chinuch, for laying them out how they appear in the text. But if we're actually going to work with these in a functional way and organize a society around them, we've got to have them organized by topics. We've got to have all the laws of keeping kosher in one place, all the laws of keeping Shabbat in the other place, all the laws of, civil, criminal law have to be in one place and things like that. So the codifiers begin to say, all right, organize this here. This is the mitzvah here. This is the mitzvah here. And remember that there's significant debate about what exactly is the mitzvah and how does it apply and under what circumstances is one exempt from it. All of these things are really important. So the codifiers who create, for example, the Rosh created a very important commentary called the Arba Turim, the 4 columns or the 4 pillars, which correspond to 4 different aspects of human life. They end up becoming the source of tremendous dispute and commentaries on the codes. But nevertheless, they are hugely important. The most important of them for contemporary usage is undoubtedly the Shulchan Aruch. We'll speak about him, God willing, later on in this class as well. So these are the 3 main areas that give the Rishonim their distinctive sort of functions. They're really involved in these things, and with the limited exception of counters, all of the Acharonim afterwards are kind of following in their footsteps. Now, at the same time, what's really fascinating to me as well is that the Rishonim are not all uniform at all. They are highly individualized and idiosyncratic. The Rashba and the Ritva and the Rambam, totally different people, different approaches, different personalities. And sometimes they pose questions and provide answers which are shockingly modern. And you say, like, what is going on here? Where did this idea come from? And how come I don't see it in the traditional codes and so on? So among those kind of outliers are brilliant figures like Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra, who was not only a commentator of note, he was also a tremendous poet in Arabic and in Hebrew, and a scientist. There is a crater on the moon named after him. He is the subject, by the way, of some poetry in the English language as well. Here he is holding up an astrolabe in his left hand and a compass in his right, which alludes to his kind of early scientific burgeoning curiosity. Lived a very poor, difficult life, traveled out of his poverty. He would, and again, this is before printing, so he would literally write out his manuscripts, and then because he was so poor, he would sell his manuscripts, his only copy sometimes, and then have to rewrite them entirely from memory to sell them again. The things he wrote about his poverty are extremely biting, but it also gives you a sense of, wow, this is like so unlike Rashi, so unlike the others. You see also Gersonides, also a Rishon who is not widely studied today, but brilliant, very cutting against the grain kind of commentaries on all kinds of issues which are of extreme relevance today. And when you study some of these Rishonim, you say, wow, this is like alternate history. Like, what would have happened to Jewish civilization if we decided that the halacha, the law, followed Gersonides and not, let's say, the Rosh? Very, very different kind of possibilities and fascinating for our purposes. We're going to come back to both Gersonides and Ibn Ezra, I think, when we talk about the scientific revolution and Jews involved in it. But this gives you just a sense of the idea that there are many outliers among the Rishonim. it's hardly a monolithic, singularly orthodox way of looking at the world. The Rishonim had a tremendous scope and spectrum of activity and interest and so on. Okay, I see that I got a little bit too excited there and I spoke too long about some of these things. So let's look at Maimonides specifically. And he is really special because, among other things, he is the greatest of the outliers. I mean, he is so amazing unto himself as a scholar, as someone who is active in all of these areas and many more, but at the same time, he was the most vilified during his lifetime and especially shortly after his lifetime, so much so that Jews actually were responsible for burning Maimonides' books, if you can believe that. I'll get to that story.